The morning fog lifts slowly over the North Sea, revealing a sight that would forever change the course of European history. A fleet of sleek wooden vessels cuts through the gray waters, their dragon-headed prows emerging from the mist like apparitions from another world. The year is 820 CE, and these are the dreaded Longships of the North, vessels so advanced in their design and so numerous in their deployment that the coastal kingdoms of Europe would soon find themselves utterly defenseless against this maritime revolution. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now let's begin. The coastlines of 9th century Europe existed in a state of relative tranquility. For centuries, the seas had ceased to be pathways of invasion. The Roman fleet was a distant memory, and the maritime ambitions of Charlemagne and other European monarchs extended little beyond coastal patrols and merchant protection. The great kingdoms of Francia, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria turned their attention inward, building churches rather than ships, monasteries instead of harbors. Their shores lay exposed, their maritime defenses neglected, a vulnerability that would soon be exploited with devastating consequences. In the meantime, far to the north, an entirely different relationship with the sea was developing. Across the fjords and inlets of Scandinavia, communities had been perfecting the art of shipbuilding for generations. The harsh geography of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with their jagged coastlines, countless islands, and treacherous waters, demanded innovation. Overland travel was difficult, often impossible, through the dense forests and rugged mountains. The sea was not a barrier, but a highway, not a threat, but an opportunity. The people of the North became seafarers, not by choice, but by necessity. Life in these northern realms was defined by the seasonal rhythm of the sea. Settlements clustered around natural harbors, their economies dependent on fishing and coastal trade. Children learned to row almost as soon as they could walk, developing an intuitive understanding of tides, winds, and currents. The sagas tell us that even kings and jarls worked alongside their shipwrights, getting their hands blistered and splintered in the communal effort of vessel construction. According to the Icelandic sagas, the legendary King Harald Fairhair of Norway was said to personally oversee the building of his royal longship, the Dreki, the dragon. This intimate connection between leadership and shipcraft stands in stark contrast to the European monarchs who delegated such technical matters to subordinates. The Norse cosmology itself reflected this maritime orientation. Their myths spoke of a world encircled by the great sea serpent Jörmungandr. Their afterlife, Valhalla, was reached by a ship voyage guided by the Valkyries. Even their gods traveled by ship, Thor crossing the cosmic ocean to battle giants, Freyr commanding the magical vessel Skidbladnir that could be folded and carried in a pouch when not in use. The ship was not merely a tool, but a sacred symbol, a vessel between worlds, both physical and spiritual. This cultural reverence for ships manifested in their burial practices. At Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, archaeologists have uncovered magnificent ship burials where chieftains and noblewomen were interred in fully equipped vessels, surrounded by treasures, provisions, and even sacrificed animals, everything needed for the journey to the afterlife. These archaeological treasures reveal the astonishing sophistication of Norse shipbuilding by the early 9th century, centuries of accumulated knowledge preserved in oak and pine, in iron rivets and woolen sails. The secret to the Vikings' maritime dominance lay in their revolutionary approach to shipbuilding. While their contemporaries in Europe were constructing heavy, cumbersome vessels dependent on fair winds and deep harbors, the Norsemen were developing the most versatile seagoing craft the world had ever seen. The longship represented the perfect fusion of technical innovation and practical application, the apex of early medieval shipwrights' art. What made these vessels so exceptional? The answer lies in their unique construction method. Unlike the Mediterranean tradition of building the hull first and then adding internal framing, Viking shipwrights worked from the keel up using a clinker-built technique. Overlapping wooden planks were fastened with iron rivets, creating a hull both lightweight and flexible. The result was a vessel that could bend with the waves rather than fight against them, distributing the force of rough seas throughout its structure instead of concentrating stress at single points. As a ship flexed in heavy waters, the overlapping planks would tighten rather than split, a feature that sailors' lives depended on when crossing the treacherous North Atlantic. The dimensions of the typical longship were precisely calculated for optimal performance. Archaeological finds reveal vessels ranging from 50 to 120 feet in length, yet remarkably narrow, usually between 8 and 14 feet of beam. This slender profile, combined with a shallow draft of just 3 feet, produced a vessel that could achieve remarkable speeds. Modern reconstructions have demonstrated that longships could sustain speeds of 10 and 11 knots under sail in favorable conditions, with bursts up to 15 knots possible, velocities that would remain impressive even by 19th century standards. The dual propulsion system of sail and oar gave these vessels unprecedented versatility. When winds were favorable, a single square sail of approximately 90 square meters provided efficient power. When winds failed or precise maneuvering was required, dual banks of oars, between 24 and 50 depending on the vessel's size, allowed continuous progress. This combination meant that Viking longships were never at the mercy of the elements, as their European counterparts often were, waiting days or even weeks for favorable winds in protected harbors. The longship's shallow draft conferred perhaps its greatest tactical advantage. While European vessels required deep-water ports with constructed docks and facilities, Viking ships could land directly on any beach, river mouth, or inlet. This amphibious capability transformed every stretch of coastline, every navigable river, into a potential landing zone. No settlement within 20 miles of coast or river could consider itself safe from sudden raid or invasion. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle grimly recorded after the devastating raid on Lindisfarne in 793, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered at the hands of the heathen. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." The psychological impact of these vessels cannot be overstated. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Frankish annals describe the terror inspired by the mere sight of the dragon-headed prows appearing on the horizon. The speed with which Viking forces could appear, strike, and vanish before local defenses could mobilize seemed supernatural to their victims. As the chronicler Alcuin wrote in a letter to King Ethelred of Northumbria, "The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." Such accounts, while perhaps embellished, reflect the genuine shock these raids provoked across Christian Europe. While European kingdoms struggled to field even modest naval forces, Scandinavian societies mobilized maritime resources on an industrial scale. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that during the height of the Viking Age, between 800 and 1000 CE, Norse communities constructed and maintained a staggering fleet numbering in the thousands. The logistics of this shipbuilding enterprise were formidable, requiring vast quantities of timber, iron, and textiles. The construction of a single longship demanded specialized materials carefully selected for their properties. The keel required a single straight oak trunk of exceptional length. The strakes, the overlapping planks forming the hull, were typically oak, split radially from the log rather than sawn, preserving the wood's natural strength along the grain. Each strake was carefully shaped with axes and adzes to ensure perfect fit with its neighbors. Iron rivets, thousands per ship, were hand-forged by skilled blacksmiths. The sail, typically made from woven wool, required the fleece of hundreds of sheep, representing months of spinning and weaving by skilled craftspeople, usually women whose expertise was as crucial to maritime success as that of the shipwrights themselves. The resources required for this level of production transformed Scandinavian societies. Forests were managed rather than simply harvested, with woodland carefully protected as strategic assets. Iron production increased dramatically, with thousands of bloomery furnaces processing bog iron across the region. Textile production became increasingly specialized, with sailing cloth emerging as a standardized product. This was, in every sense, a maritime economy geared toward projecting power abroad. The contrast with continental Europe could not have been more stark. When the Emperor Charlemagne, ruler of a vast empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, attempted to establish a navy to counter Viking incursions in the early 9th century, his efforts were remarkably limited. The Royal Frankish Annals record that he built a fleet against the Nordic pirates in 800 CE, but archaeological and documentary evidence suggests this consisted of perhaps a few dozen vessels, primarily rivercraft unsuited to open sea operations. Despite commanding the resources of half of Christian Europe, Charlemagne could not match even a fraction of Norse shipbuilding capacity. In Anglo-Saxon England, the situation was even more dire. Despite being an island nation with a strong maritime tradition stretching back to their own migration period, the English kingdoms had largely abandoned naval defense by the 8th century. King Alfred the Great of Wessex is credited with creating the first standing navy in England, but his initial fleet in the 870s consisted of just 9 vessels built on his novel design, larger than Viking ships but also slower and less maneuverable. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with evident pride that these ships defeated a small Viking squadron of 6 vessels in 882, but such victories were rare exceptions to Norse dominance at sea. The scale of Viking naval operations is recorded in contemporary chronicles, with a mixture of awe and terror. The Annals of St. Bertin describe a fleet of 350 Viking ships sailing up the Seine in 861. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a great army arriving in East Anglia in 865 with a fleet so large it could not be counted. While some scholarly skepticism about these numbers is warranted, archaeological evidence increasingly confirms the substantial scale of these operations. The harbor facilities uncovered at Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang could accommodate hundreds of vessels simultaneously, while the logistical organization required to build, maintain, and crew such fleets points to sophisticated administrative systems. The manpower implications of this naval capacity were equally significant. A typical longship required a crew of 25 to 60 warriors, depending on its size. A fleet of 100 vessels, modest by Viking standards, could therefore deliver an army of 3,000 to 6,000 men to any target within their operational range, which by the mid-9th century extended from North America to the Caspian Sea, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. This ability to concentrate military force rapidly and precisely gave Norse leaders a strategic advantage that land-bound European kingdoms struggled to counter. The impact of this naval disparity fundamentally altered European history. The initial shock of Viking raids in the late 8th century gave way to more ambitious operations by the mid-9th. No longer content with hit-and-run attacks on coastal monasteries and towns, Viking fleets began to penetrate deep inland via navigable rivers. Paris was besieged by a fleet of 120 ships in 845, and again by 700 vessels in 885-886. Dublin, Rouen, Nantes, Seville, London, Hamburg, all major European cities, fell to amphibious assaults made possible by longship technology. By the 860s, Viking forces had progressed from raiding to conquest and settlement. The great heathen army that landed in East Anglia in 865 systematically conquered 3 of England's 4 major kingdoms within a decade. Similar large-scale operations established Viking control over Dublin, Normandy, parts of Scotland, and coastal regions throughout the Baltic. The ability to transport large forces rapidly by sea, landing them precisely where defenses were weakest, repeatedly proved decisive. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of Norse naval supremacy came in 911, when the Viking leader Rollo forced the Frankish king Charles the Simple to cede what would become Normandy, a territory named for the Northmen who conquered it. The Frankish kingdom, despite its vast resources and military tradition, simply could not defend its coastlines and river systems against Norse maritime mobility. The pragmatic solution was to grant land to Vikings in exchange for their promise to prevent further raids, essentially outsourcing coastal defense to the only people who had demonstrated the capacity to control the seas. The technological gap between Norse and European shipbuilding was not merely a matter of design innovation, but reflected fundamentally different social and economic priorities. Scandinavian societies organized themselves around maritime capability as a core strategic asset, while European kingdoms concentrated resources on land-based power projection, castles, cathedrals, and cavalry. The sagas and historical accounts describe how shipbuilding in Norse society was often a communal enterprise. While wealthy jarls and kings certainly commissioned vessels, many longships were built and maintained by communities organized in guilds or cooperatives called lid or felag. These associations would collectively fund construction, provide crews, and share in the profits of trading or raiding expeditions. The famous jelling stones erected by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark in the late 10th century boast that he won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The ability to make such a claim rested ultimately on naval power, the capacity to transport forces throughout his realm and enforce royal authority, even in distant provinces. Shipbuilding knowledge was preserved and transmitted through rigorous apprenticeship systems. Young men learned the complex skills of selecting timbers, shaping strakes, and calculating the precise proportions that would make a vessel seaworthy. This knowledge was so valued that, in some regions, skilled shipwrights enjoyed legal protections and privileges, similar to those granted to priests or nobles. The 10th century gulating law from western Norway specifically prohibited the killing of 3 men even in blood feud: the priest, the shipbuilder, and the smith. This legal protection underscores the strategic importance attached to shipbuilding expertise. The most remarkable aspect of Viking naval dominance was its sustainability over generations. From the first recorded raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Norman conquest of England in 1066, itself a Viking enterprise in many respects, Norse maritime superiority remained largely unchallenged for nearly 3 centuries. This required not merely the initial innovation of longship technology, but a continuous process of refinement, maintenance, and reproduction on a massive scale. Archaeological evidence reveals this continuous evolution. The Gokstad ship, built around 890 CE, shows subtle but significant improvements over the earlier Oseberg vessel from around 820 CE. The strake overlaps are more precisely calculated, the keel more efficiently shaped, the internal framing more elegantly designed. These incremental improvements reflect a culture of constant refinement and innovation, responding to the practical experiences of sailors and warriors who depended on these vessels for their lives and livelihoods. Contemporary European sources gradually recognized the superiority of Norse ship design. By the late 10th century, some European powers began attempting to adopt elements of Viking naval technology. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that King Ethelred II, the Unready, ordered the construction of a fleet according to the model in which the Danes had built their ships in 1008. Similarly, the Normans, themselves descendants of Viking settlers, maintained a strong maritime tradition, as dramatically demonstrated in the Bayeux Tapestry's depiction of William the Conqueror's invasion fleet in 1066. This eventual technology transfer represents a tacit acknowledgement of Norse maritime superiority. The economic foundation that supported this vast shipbuilding enterprise reveals much about Viking society. While popular imagination often focuses exclusively on raiding, The Norse maritime economy was diverse and sophisticated. Trade networks stretched from Greenland to Baghdad, with Norse merchants exchanging amber, furs, walrus ivory, and slaves for silver, spices, silks, and wine. Archaeological excavations at trading centers like Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark have uncovered goods from as far away as China and North Africa, testament to the reach of Viking commercial networks. This commercial activity both funded and justified the maintenance of large fleets. Many vessels served dual purposes: merchant ships in peaceful seasons, warships when opportunity or necessity arose. The economic model was remarkably efficient. Ships that brought furs and ivory to foreign markets could return with plunder and slaves. This integration of commercial and military maritime activity stands in sharp contrast to later European models, where navies would become specialized state institutions separate from merchant marines. The sagas describe how successful trading voyages could fund shipbuilding directly. In Egil's saga, the protagonist uses profits from a single trading expedition to Norway to commission a new ocean-going vessel. Similar accounts appear throughout the Norse literary corpus, suggesting a maritime entrepreneurial culture where successful voyages generated capital for fleet expansion, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of maritime growth. The logistical challenges of maintaining thousands of vessels were considerable. Longships, despite their durability, typically had operational lifespans of about 10 to 15 years before requiring significant rebuilding. This meant that hundreds of new vessels needed to be constructed annually just to maintain existing fleet capacity. Timber resources were carefully managed, with forest laws protecting shipbuilding woods. The Frostathing law from Norway includes specific provisions protecting oak trees suitable for keels and stems, with heavy penalties for unauthorized felling. Shipyards have been archaeologically identified throughout Scandinavia, often associated with trading centers and royal estates. These facilities operated year-round, with construction primarily taking place during winter months when agricultural demands were reduced. Summer was reserved for voyaging, with autumn being the season for repairs and maintenance. This annual cycle integrated shipbuilding into the broader seasonal rhythms of Norse society. The naval imbalance between Viking and European forces had profound psychological impacts on medieval European consciousness. The suddenness and violence of Norse raids created a pervasive sense of vulnerability that shaped European defensive thinking for generations. Monastery chronicles describe elaborate systems for detecting approaching Viking fleets and evacuating valuables and relics inland. Coastal settlements throughout Europe were abandoned or relocated to more defensible inland locations. The litany of prayers in many European churches came to include the phrase, "From the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us," a testament to the psychological trauma inflicted by Viking naval supremacy. This sense of maritime vulnerability accelerated the development of feudalism in many regions. Unable to defend their territories from Norse amphibious mobility, rulers delegated defensive responsibilities to local lords, granting them lands in exchange for maintaining armed retainers who could respond to Viking incursions. The decentralization of political and military authority that characterized European feudalism was, in part, an adaptation to the strategic problem posed by Viking naval power. By the mid-10th century, European kingdoms had begun developing more effective countermeasures. Rather than attempting to challenge Viking forces at sea, a contest they could rarely win, they adopted a strategy of coastal fortification. Networks of fortified bridges prevented longships from penetrating inland waterways. Defensive burhs established by Alfred the Great in England created fortified market towns that could withstand Viking assaults. Similar systems appeared throughout Francia and the Low Countries. These defensive adaptations gradually reduced the effectiveness of Viking raids, though not their frequency. Chronicle accounts from the late 10th century describe increasingly sophisticated European defensive responses, with local forces mobilizing more rapidly and effectively to counter Norse incursions. The economic calculation of raiding began to shift as potential targets became harder and costlier to attack. The political implications of this naval disparity were equally profound. The Viking threat accelerated state formation throughout Europe as rulers centralized authority and resources to counter Norse aggression. King Alfred's reforms in Wessex, creating a standing army, the Feuard, establishing a tax system to fund defense, and building fortified burhs throughout his kingdom, represent a significant expansion of royal power justified by the need to counter Viking threats. Similar processes occurred in Francia, Scotland, and Ireland, with rulers leveraging the external threat to consolidate internal authority. Paradoxically, while European kingdoms were developing stronger central institutions in response to the Viking threat, Scandinavian societies were undergoing their own political transformations. The wealth generated by raiding and trading funded the emergence of more centralized monarchies in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, Harald Fairhair in Norway, and Eric the Victorious in Sweden all used maritime wealth and power to subordinate regional chieftains and establish more unified kingdoms. By the late 10th century, these emerging Scandinavian monarchies began converting to Christianity, partly as a diplomatic strategy to normalize relations with European powers. The conversion of Harald Bluetooth of Denmark around 965, followed by Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson in Norway, and Olaf Skotkonung in Sweden, marked a significant shift in Norse religious and political orientation. These newly Christian kings increasingly redirected maritime resources towards state-building rather than raiding. This political and religious transformation coincided with a gradual decline in Viking raiding activity. While large-scale expeditions continued into the early 11th century, such as Sweyn Forkbeard's conquest of England in 1013 and his son Cnut's establishment of a North Sea empire encompassing England, Denmark, and Norway. These were increasingly state-sponsored military campaigns, rather than the independent raiding ventures of earlier periods. The decline of Viking naval dominance accelerated in the 11th century, as European powers finally began developing significant maritime capabilities of their own. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, though led by descendants of Vikings, represented a new model of cross-channel power projection. William the Conqueror assembled a fleet of approximately 700 vessels for his invasion, a force comparable to the largest Viking fleets of previous centuries, but did so as a state enterprise, rather than through the decentralized entrepreneurial model that had characterized earlier Norse maritime activity. The ecological impact of 3 centuries of intensive shipbuilding ultimately contributed to the decline of Viking maritime power. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence suggests significant deforestation in key shipbuilding regions of Scandinavia by the 11th century. The most desirable shipbuilding timbers, straight-grained oak for keels and stems, tall pines for masts, became increasingly scarce and costly. This resource depletion coincided with climate change, as the medieval warm period that had facilitated North Atlantic exploration began giving way to cooler conditions, making long-distance voyaging more hazardous. As the 11th century progressed, European shipbuilding gradually incorporated many of the innovations that had made longships so formidable. The distinctive clinker-built construction technique spread throughout northern Europe, with the Hanseatic cog of the 12th and 13th centuries representing a hybrid design incorporating elements of both Norse and Frisian shipbuilding traditions. The naval gap gradually narrowed as European powers developed more capable vessels and more sophisticated maritime infrastructure. The legacy of Viking naval dominance endured long after the raids had ceased. Norse maritime expertise directly influenced the development of European seafaring traditions. The Viking expansion into the North Atlantic, establishing settlements in the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and briefly in North America, demonstrated the possibilities of transoceanic voyaging centuries before the age of exploration. The navigational techniques developed by Norse sailors, including the use of sundials, polarization stones for locating the sun on cloudy days, and detailed mental mapping of coastal features, established foundations for later maritime advances. The linguistic impact of this naval disparity remains embedded in English and other European languages. Words like keel, hull, bow, oar, rudder, anchor, and dozens of other nautical terms derive from Old Norse, testament to the technological superiority that forced Europeans to adopt not just Viking shipbuilding techniques, but the terminology that described them. The physical legacy of Viking shipbuilding lives on in maritime museums throughout Scandinavia. The perfectly preserved vessels recovered from burial mounds at Usberg, Gokstad, and Thun in Norway provide tangible connections to this remarkable maritime tradition. Modern reconstructions have demonstrated the exceptional seaworthiness of these ancient designs. The replica Gokstad ship Viking sailed across the Atlantic in 1893, while the reconstructed Skuldelev ship Sea Stallion of Glendalau completed the voyage from Denmark to Dublin in 2007, retracing ancient Norse sailing routes. Perhaps the most profound legacy of this period is how it reshaped European consciousness about maritime power. The Viking Age demonstrated conclusively that control of the sea conferred strategic advantages that land-bound powers could not easily counter. This lesson would be relearned repeatedly throughout European history, from the rise of Portuguese and Spanish maritime empires in the 15th century to British naval dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries. The contrast between Viking naval capacity and European maritime weakness in the early Middle Ages ultimately reflects different responses to geographical imperatives. For Scandinavian peoples, the sea was the primary highway connecting communities and enabling commerce. Investment in maritime technology was not a luxury, but a necessity. For continental European powers, with their Roman inheritance of roads and urban centers, maritime capability seemed less essential until Viking raids demonstrated its strategic importance. To truly understand the revolutionary nature of the Longship, we must examine the technical details that set these vessels apart from anything else afloat in 9th century Europe. The keel, the backbone of any ship, was typically fashioned from a single oak trunk, carefully selected for its straight grain and natural curve. This piece alone could measure up to 70 feet in length, requiring exceptional forestry management to ensure trees of suitable dimensions were available. The stem and stern posts, which gave longships their distinctive curved profile, were similarly carved from naturally curved sections of oak, often from the lower trunk and root section, where the tree's growth pattern provided the ideal shape. The strakes, or planks that formed the hull, were split rather than sawn from logs, following the natural grain of the wood to maintain maximum strength. This radial splitting technique preserved the internal cellular structure of the timber, making each plank more resistant to bending and breaking than sawn boards would be. The overlapping clinker construction created multiple layers at the joints, distributing stress throughout the hull rather than concentrating it at specific points. The fastening system used to connect these planks was equally innovative. Iron rivets, each handcrafted by skilled smiths, secured the overlapping strakes. These rivets, estimated at between 1,500 and 2,500 per vessel, depending on size, represented a significant investment of resources and labor. Each rivet hole was carefully drilled, not punched, to avoid splitting the wood. The rivet was then inserted from outside, with a small iron plate or rove placed over the protruding end inside the hull. The end was then hammered flat over the rove, creating a secure, waterproof connection that could nonetheless flex with the movement of the hull. Between each overlapping strake, a caulking material made from twisted animal hair or plant fibers soaked in pine tar was inserted to ensure watertight seals. This caulking required regular maintenance, with ships being beached periodically to check and renew this vital waterproofing. The construction method created a hull that was remarkably light yet immensely strong, a vessel that could carry 60 warriors and their equipment across open ocean, yet still be light enough to be portaged over land when necessary. The internal framing of longships reveals another aspect of their sophisticated design. Rather than building a rigid internal skeleton first, as became standard in later shipbuilding traditions, Norse vessels were primarily constructed shell first, with internal ribs added after the hull was largely complete. These ribs, typically made of naturally curved sections of pine or oak, were lashed rather than nailed to the strakes in many vessels, creating a flexible connection that allowed the hull to twist slightly in heavy seas without breaking. This counterintuitive approach, prioritizing flexibility over rigidity, proved remarkably effective in the stormy northern waters. The sailing rig of the typical longship was deceptively simple, yet highly efficient. A single square sail, usually made from woven wool and treated with beeswax, animal fat, and ochre for waterproofing and visibility, provided the main propulsion. The mast, typically pine and up to 40 feet tall, was stepped in a massive wooden block called a keelson, which distributed the enormous forces generated by the sail throughout the hull, rather than concentrating them on the keel alone. The rigging system employed blocks and tackles that allowed the sail to be quickly raised, lowered, or reefed, depending on wind conditions. When not in use, the entire mast could be lowered and stowed along the center line of the vessel, reducing wind resistance when under oar power. This ability to quickly transition between sail and oar propulsion gave longships a tactical advantage that European vessels, typically committed to either one mode or the other, could not match. The oar system itself represented another technical achievement. Each oar station was carefully positioned to ensure optimal leverage and minimal interference between rowers. Oar ports were often fitted with flexible shutters that could be closed when sailing, preventing water ingress in rough conditions. The oars themselves, typically 15-20 feet in length, were carefully shaped to balance strength and weight, with blades designed for maximum efficiency. Archaeological finds suggest that many vessels carried spare oars, acknowledging their importance to the ship's mobility. Navigation techniques developed by Norse sailors were equally sophisticated, combining practical observation with astronomical knowledge. Without magnetic compasses, Viking navigators relied on solar positioning, stellar observations, and intimate knowledge of prevailing winds and currents. The sun shadow board, a simple yet effective navigational tool found in several archaeological contexts, allowed sailors to determine their approximate latitude by measuring the shadow cast by a central gnomon at noon. Similarly, the sunstone, likely a form of Iceland's spar crystal with polarizing properties, may have allowed navigators to determine the position of the sun even on overcast days, a crucial ability in northern waters. This technical sophistication extended to the operational logistics of Viking fleets. The sagas and archaeological evidence suggest standardized provisioning systems for long voyages. Ships typically carried dried and preserved foods, smoked meat, dried fish, hard bread, and butter stored in soapstone containers that kept it fresh for extended periods. Water was carried in wooden barrels, supplemented by beer and buttermilk, which remained potable longer than plain water. Sophisticated rainwater collection systems have been identified on some vessels, extending their range between landfalls. The construction of a single longship typically required 11,000 to 15,000 hours of skilled labor, equivalent to 6 to 8 shipwrights working for a full year. This investment was multiplied thousands of times across the Viking world, with major centers like Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang simultaneously supporting multiple construction projects. The organizational capacity required to coordinate this level of production, managing timber supplies, iron production, textile manufacture, and skilled labor, points to sophisticated administrative systems that belie the popular image of Vikings as mere raiders. The operational range of these vessels was unprecedented for their time. Archaeological evidence and literary sources confirm regular Viking voyages from Scandinavia to Iceland, approximately 600 nautical miles, from Iceland to Greenland, about 900 nautical miles, and even from Greenland to Newfoundland, roughly 1,500 nautical miles. These transoceanic voyages required not only seaworthy vessels, but exceptional navigational skills and detailed knowledge of wind patterns, currents, and seabird distributions that might indicate proximity to land. The Norse exploration of the North Atlantic represents one of history's most remarkable feats of seamanship, achieved with technology that, while sophisticated, relied entirely on wind, muscle power, and human skill. The river-going capabilities of Longships further extended their operational reach. Archaeological evidence and historical records confirm Viking penetration deep into the continental interiors of Europe, Russia, and Ukraine via river systems. Ships have been found or documented hundreds of miles inland, reaching locations such as Kiev via the Dnieper River and Paris via the Seine. This ability to transition seamlessly between open ocean, coastal, and riverine operations gave Viking forces a strategic mobility unmatched by any contemporary power. European chronicles record the awe and fear inspired by the speed of these vessels. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that in 865, a great heathen army appeared in East Anglia so suddenly that local forces had no time to mobilize before the Vikings secured a beachhead. Similar accounts from Francia, Ireland, and Spain describe the shock of coastal communities at the rapid appearance of Norse fleets. Modern reconstructions suggest that under favorable conditions, Viking longships could maintain average speeds of 5 to 6 knots under sail for extended periods, with bursts of 10 to 12 knots possible during sprints under oar power. This combination of sustained cruising ability and short-term sprint capacity created a vessel equally suited to long-distance voyaging and rapid tactical maneuvers. The total size of the combined Norse fleet during the height of the Viking Age remains a subject of scholarly debate, but contemporary sources and archaeological evidence suggest numbers that dwarf anything available to European powers. The Annals of St. Bertit record a fleet of 600 ships attacking Hamburg in 845. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions fleets of 350 vessels appearing off English coasts. While some skepticism about these specific numbers is warranted, the archaeological evidence of harbor facilities, shipbuilding sites, and the known scale of Norse maritime operations all point to a combined fleet numbering in the thousands rather than hundreds. This maritime disparity created a strategic asymmetry that European powers struggled to address. Contemporary chronicles describe the frustration of Frankish and Anglo-Saxon forces attempting to intercept Viking fleets. King Alfred's navy, despite its innovations, was consistently outmaneuvered by more nimble Norse vessels. The Frankish Emperor Charles the Bald constructed fortified bridges across the Seine and other rivers to prevent Viking penetration inland, tacitly acknowledging his inability to challenge them at sea. These defensive adaptations represent implicit recognition of Norse maritime superiority. The economic impact of this naval imbalance was equally profound. Viking control of sea lanes disrupted traditional European trade patterns, forcing merchants to reroute or pay protection money to Norse chieftains. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby and Birka shows a dramatic increase in international goods during the 9th century, suggesting that Viking maritime networks were increasingly dominating northern European commerce. Silver hoards found throughout Scandinavia, containing coins from as far away as Baghdad and Samarkand, testify to the wealth generated by this combination of raiding and trading. As Norse maritime dominance continued into the 10th century, ambitious leaders began leveraging this advantage for territorial conquest, rather than mere raiding. The establishment of Viking Dublin around 841, followed by settlements throughout Ireland, Scotland, and the Northern and Western Isles, created a Norse maritime network across the Irish Sea region. Similarly, Danish conquest of large portions of England, the region known as the Danelaw, established a territorial foothold that would influence English development for centuries. The Norman acquisition of territory in northern France completed this pattern of maritime mobility, transitioning to territorial control. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia in the late 10th and early 11th centuries altered the cultural context of Norse maritime activity, without immediately diminishing its scale. Christian kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Canute the Great maintained large fleets, but increasingly directed them toward state-building and defensive operations rather than raiding. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Canute maintained a standing fleet of 40 vessels after his conquest of England, a force larger than anything his Anglo-Saxon predecessors had managed, despite ruling a wealthy, populous kingdom. As the 11th century progressed, European powers gradually began adopting elements of Norse naval technology and organization. The Bayeux Tapestry provides visual evidence of this technology transfer, depicting William the Conqueror's invasion fleet of 1066, with vessels clearly influenced by Scandinavian design principles. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in the late 10th century, King Ethelred the Send ordered ships built according to the model in which the Danes had built their ships, explicitly acknowledging the superiority of Norse naval architecture. The archaeological record reveals the gradual evolution of European shipping in response to the Viking challenge. The Skålelev ships, discovered in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, include several vessels from the late Viking Age, around 1000 ties, 1050 CE, that show a diversification of ship types, specialized merchant vessels alongside traditional longships, suggesting an increasingly complex maritime economy. Similar specialization began appearing in European fleets, with distinct warships and trading vessels replacing the multi-purpose craft of earlier centuries. By the mid-11th century, the naval gap between Scandinavian and European powers had begun to narrow. Anglo-Saxon England under Edward the Confessor maintained a modest but effective fleet. The emerging maritime powers of northern Germany, precursors to the later Hanseatic League, developed increasingly sophisticated vessels incorporating Norse design elements. The Norman conquest of 1066, while led by descendants of Vikings, represented a new model of cross-channel military operations that European powers would increasingly emulate. The Norman invasion fleet that crossed the Channel in September 1066 represents both the culmination of Viking maritime tradition and its transformation into something new. William's approximately 700 vessels, a force comparable to the largest Viking fleets of previous centuries, operated as a state enterprise rather than through the decentralized entrepreneurial model that had characterized earlier Norse maritime activity. The invasion's success demonstrated that the lessons of Viking naval organization had been thoroughly absorbed by European powers, marking the beginning of the end of Scandinavian maritime dominance. As the formal Viking Age drew to a close in the late 11th century, the naval revolution it had triggered continued reshaping European maritime technology and organization. The cog, the dominant northern European vessel of the 12th and 13th centuries, incorporated many features first developed in Scandinavian shipyards, including clinker construction and efficient sailing rigs. The emerging naval powers of the High Middle Ages, England, France, Castile, and various Italian city-states, developed increasingly sophisticated fleets that would eventually surpass anything seen during the Viking Age in both size and complexity. Yet the fundamental lessons of the Viking maritime revolution, the strategic advantage conferred by control of the sea, the value of purpose-built naval forces, the importance of versatile vessel design, remained relevant long after the dragon-headed longships had disappeared from European waters. When Portugal and Spain began their global explorations in the 15th century, they were building upon foundations laid by Norse mariners who had crossed the Atlantic centuries earlier. When England developed the naval power that would eventually support a global empire, it was relearning lessons first demonstrated by the fleets that had once raided its shores. Today, as marine archaeologists continue uncovering new evidence of Viking shipbuilding and seafaring, our appreciation for this maritime revolution only deepens. The discovery of ship burials at Salme in Estonia, dating to around 750 CE, earlier than the traditional start date of the Viking Age, suggests that Norse maritime technology was already well developed before the first recorded raids on Western Europe. Similarly, ongoing excavations at Gjellestad in Norway promise to reveal a previously unknown ship burial, potentially adding to our understanding of Viking naval architecture. Recent archaeological work has also revealed new dimensions of Viking maritime logistics. Excavations at Lyngdalur in Norway have uncovered what appears to be a specialized sail-making workshop, providing insights into the textile production that supported Norse seafaring. Analysis of tar kilns throughout Scandinavia suggests industrial-scale production of waterproofing materials essential for ship maintenance. These discoveries reinforce our understanding of Viking shipbuilding as not merely a technical achievement, but a complex socio-economic system that mobilized resources across entire societies. Modern reconstructions of Viking vessels continue to demonstrate their remarkable capabilities. In 2012, the reconstruction Draken Harald Hårfagre, at 115 feet, the largest Viking ship replica built in modern times, successfully crossed the Atlantic following traditional routes, reaching North America via the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. The voyage demonstrated the seaworthiness of Norse designs even by modern standards, with the vessel maintaining average speeds of 6 to 7 knots under sail, despite challenging North Atlantic conditions. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter in maritime history, the achievement of those northern shipwrights remains awe-inspiring. With hand tools and empirical knowledge passed down through generations, they created vessels so perfectly adapted to their purpose that they transformed the geopolitical landscape of an entire continent. The image of the Longship, sleek, fast, deadly in its efficiency, remains the defining symbol of the Viking Age, a testament to how technological innovation in the hands of a determined people can reshape history. The seas that once carried dragon-headed ships to distant shores now bear different vessels, but the legacy of those northern mariners lives on in our languages, in our maritime traditions, and in our understanding of how human ingenuity, when focused on mastering the sea, can reshape the course of history itself. As the midnight sun casts its golden light across the fjords of Scandinavia, we can still glimpse the shadows of those ancient vessels, the 10,000 longships that once ruled the waves of medieval Europe, and in doing so, changed the world forever.